Hello, hello, good morning. I'm Andy Ledger from DPass. By public demand, I haven't got my camera on this morning, so you'll just have to imagine me. This morning, I'm delighted to welcome two gurus of the freedom of information world, Naomi and Bilal. Before they get started, I just want to give a quick plug to some of our services. Um, so, we deliver a series of accredited training courses including a foundation certificate in FOI, a one-day course, and also our ever popular 5-day BCS practitioner in freedom of information. We also deliver an extensive range of consultancy services, including outsourced DPO services, SAR processing services, data privacy impact assessments, and of increasing relevance at this time of year, NHS DSPT audits. Just a reminder as well, in case you don't already know, it's our annual free conference in Bristol on the 12th of February. We'd absolutely love to see you all there. We'll send you out some sign-up details if you haven't had those already. It is free. It's a really great opportunity to meet and mingle with peers from the world of data protection, compliance, and actually beyond that as well, really. It's a good day out. Now for the inevitable housekeeping. Please use the chat in the screen to ask questions. Questions are the lifeblood of the webinar, so please feel free to ask any questions you like to Naomi and Bilal. They'll endeavour to answer as many questions as possible in the life of the webinar, but otherwise we'll try and get back to you afterwards with questions, particularly some that may be more complex. As you just heard, the webinar is being recorded. We're going to be sending out a recording to everybody afterwards so you can enjoy the highlights again at your leisure. And finally, I'm just going to say that the webinar is going to last approximately 60 minutes. And now, without further ado, here's Naomi and Bilal to introduce themselves.
Thanks very much. My name is Bilal Ghafoor. I started doing freedom of information about 15 years ago, completely by accident, a completely ridiculous story. I just happened to be sitting next to people who were doing it. And although I now do more data protection than FOI, it remains my first love.
Good morning, I'm Naomi Matthews. I can't say that freedom of information was my first love, but it's certainly an enduring passion, let's put it like that. I'm one of these people who can't hold down a full-time job, so I have what they call a portfolio of interests, and amongst them I teach data protection and freedom of information, and I've also been responsible at a large public authority for freedom of information requests, as well as being a freedom of information solicitor. So hopefully can see freedom of information requests from a few different angles, or that's my story anyway. Starting off, can we jump straight into it, Bilal? Is that okay?
Yeah,
My
absolutely.
first question, and I think this is a good one for you. It says, since David Cameron's government asks so many public authorities to publish spend, does Section 43 apply to financial information at all?
It does. So David Cameron's government was around 10, 15 years ago. So it's been around for a while that they put in this transparency agenda, and they asked a lot of public authorities, so particularly NHS and local councils, to publish spend. So you should be able, in theory, to go online. Although I see that some of them have kind of abandoned this. You should be able to go online and see what money they've spent over a certain threshold. So while you can still see spend, what you can't see exactly without trying to put an FOI request in is exactly what it is they spent it on. So whereas they might say we spent, £1 million on computers, what that spend won't tell you is how much each computer cost. So overall spending, yes, absolutely, that's kind of out there in quite a lot of instances. But what you can't do is get the breakdown. And it's the breakdown that often harms commercial interests. So that sometimes can still be withheld. So yes, while there is a hell of a lot more transparency now than there was before, yeah, Section 43 is still valid. Although I have to say one thing, it has changed over the last sort of 15, 20 years, in the sense that at the beginning, everyone used to cite 43, and the commissioner, my sense is, used to really kind of let them get away with it. Now it's much, much more difficult to do so, and you've really got to drill into the detail.
All right. So where people get confused a bit is Section 43 is about more than just commercial sensitivities. Is that right? What's a trade secret in the context of Section 43?
So 43.1 is kind of underused, and if you go on onto the ICO's decision notices and you look at the drop down, you'll find you can select 43.2, but what you can't do is select 43.1. It doesn't mean it's not there. There aren't any decision notices, but there aren't enough for the commissioner to have kind of allocated it its own category. So trade secrets. I mean, if anyone KFC's seven herbs and spices, the formula for Coke. These are kind of the most famous trade secrets out there. People have been for years trying to replicate exactly what they are. Those are the kinds of things that are usually thought of as trade secrets. So trade secret is generally something that isn't it's a formula or a set of information that isn't generally well known. It has to have value, and if in such a way that if it was released, that harm would be caused, and the person holding the trade secret should have taken some reasonable steps to try to keep it a secret. So if you have all of those three elements, then it is a trade secret. So, but whereas most people tend to think of it as kind of a recipe, things like how a particular medication is made, etc., it can also be other things. It can, it can be particular pricing formulas or algorithms. It can be strategies that people have for market penetration. So if you find that something has a value, is not well known, and the company is or the people who own the trade secret are taking steps to look after it, and that there is inherently harm in releasing it, then it may well be a trade secret. And because it's a class-based exemption, it might be slightly easier to use. But that's kind of what it is.
Okay. Well, another thing that causes, I think, some confusion is why is trade secret class-based, but commercial interests in 43.2 is prejudice-based?
So class-based generally means that if the information is of a certain type, then it is then the exemption will automatically apply. Doesn't mean that you can then go ahead and withhold the information. You still need to go and do a public interest test, but the exemption will be engaged. The reason why 43.1 trade secret is class-based is because the definition of a trade secret already has within it the idea that the trade secret has a value, and that there would be harm if this information would be released. So it's almost like a shortcut. It's kind of within the definition of it. We can very, very easily see, and if we go back to something like the formula for Coke, we can very, very easily see that Coke is a huge, huge company. No one has quite managed to crack what the formula is. If the formula was released and other companies were able to replicate it, then potentially Coke would suffer damage. And it's obviously keeping it a secret. It does stuff to look after it. The formula isn't well known to very many people. It must be a very small number of people within the company that there will be harm, and therefore because that harm is already within the definition, there is no need for you to then reconsider harm. Whereas when it comes to 43.2, information is exempt if disclosure would harm or prejudice commercial interest. That's where you actually have to prove the commercial interest. So it's more difficult for me to say well, I don't want to tell you how much these computers cost because there would be commercial interest. I've got to prove the harm. Whereas with something like Coke, because it is a trade secret, the idea of harm is already built into the definition.
What's different then about commercial interest? What does that cover?
So commercial interest is where it's not necessarily a trade secret, or you can't assume right from the beginning that that it's a trade secret. So, for example, if you take something like how a public authority orders a bunch of computers off of a supplier, for
Mm.
example, or it's buying in any other service or so. I mean, we can kind of guess that a particular computer kind of costs this much money, but quite often organizations will get discounts. Obviously, they're buying in bulk. They might get further discounts, etc. There's nothing inherent about that where you look at it like the formula for Coke, where you go, oh, that's a trade secret. Within this, you're going to actually have to take that further step and say, oh, but this is why this is commercially sensitive. You have to say, this is what the harm is, and this is how that harm would kind of occur. So you've got to kind of take that extra step.
Okay, so talking about the harm, how are you going to gather evidence of that to satisfy the requirements?
So that this is where most people kind of tend to fall down. It's not enough to just say, "Oh, it's commercial." And I've worked in so many public authorities where my kind of business unit colleagues, you kind of say, "Oh, can we release this?" And they go, "No, no, it's commercial." Okay, thanks, bye. And this is very, very, very frustrating. To be fair, it's kind of not their fault. You've got to kind of educate them into understanding what kind of information they need to provide. So
Mhm.
the ICO kind of had a three-part test. So you've got to kind of figure out what are the interests and whose interests are they. So, for example, sometimes release of information will actually harm the public authority itself. Sometimes release of the information will harm the third party. I.e., there may be a supplier of some kind. And you've got to be very, very clear who exactly here is being harmed. You've got to work out this causal chain. It's not enough to kind of just say, if I tell it's commercially sensitive how much these computers cost, that's not going to work. You've got to be able to say this company exists in a very, very competitive arena. We're selling laptops, for example. There are lots and lots of other providers, and profit margins are relatively low. What we want to do is we want to preserve those profit margins. If we end up releasing all of this information, we will, for example, lose the ability to compete with others who might start undercutting us. So you've got to kind of say that you've got to be able to provide a real kind of causal chain to say releases of information will have this consequence, will have this consequence, and therefore that is how our commercial interests will be harmed. And time again, if you go and look at decision notices, there are around 300-ish Section 43(2) decision notices on the ICO's website, and out of those, about 180 or so, the complaint is upheld. And when you start reading them very, very quickly, you kind of realize that that's what people have done. They've kind of said, oh, yes, it's commercially sensitive, but they haven't provided the causal chain. They haven't said this is exactly how releases of information will cause this harm.
Yeah.
Once you've done that bit, you've still then got the third limb. So the third limb is to work out this whole thing where it says would or would be likely to, and that's the bit that
Mm.
also really, really matters. So would prejudice means kind of 50% or more chance, and would be likely is 50%, is below 50%, but it can't be a remote possibility. So, if something is actually incredibly unlikely, like, there's no fixed percentage, as it were. But if something is pretty unlikely, it's difficult for me to say it is, it's likely that an alien will walk into this room right now. I mean, is a chance more than zero? Yes, it is. Is a chance, actually significant? No, it's really not. So, you've got to be quite sensible about this. And I think rightly, people haven't given a percentage around this. But what you've got to do is you've really got to show what the chances are. It's perfectly fine. It doesn't weaken your argument to go with would be likely to. That makes perfect sense, and that's okay. We've got a really interesting question here, which I think I'm going
Yep.
to take. If a contract is expired, does commercial interest still apply? That's a fascinating question. The answer is it depends. So, what does it depend on? Well, if, for example, people are buying toilet paper, for example, the price of toilet paper generally kind of predictably rises and falls. Like, it's toilet paper is toilet paper. It's not a thing that really radically fluctuates. So even if a contract expired 2 or 3 years ago, but knowing what price was paid then actually does map onto what price might be paid today, then you can argue that there is still a commercial interest. Some other things fluctuate absolutely, violently, in fact. And again, if we go back to computer software, computer, my computer that was ridiculously flash 2 years ago, I could probably get 200 quid for it now, which is kind of really upsetting because it becomes redundant very quickly. So knowing how much a laptop cost a couple of years ago kind of has no real impact on what it costs today. And so, yes, I mean, it's not even about if the contract is expired. If the thing is old, then it doesn't matter. It's the same thing with property prices. In some places, they go up quite radically. There are certain kinds of tech and services that do fluctuate in their prices quite a lot. And if that happens, then even 6 months after the payment has been made, actually releasing the information today won't really do any harm because it just won't tell you about what the price might be today or what it might be in 6 months from now. But some things are kind of quite static. They kind of, a brick might just be a brick and, the price doesn't really fluctuate. So that's kind of what these things depend on.
Just coming back to when you're asking them questions to gather that evidence of harm, do you think it's a good idea to give them a time limit to come back to you, and to let them know who will make the final decision?
Yeah, so this is again one of the really, really kind of difficult things. There are some exemptions where, if someone says to you, can I please have all of your passwords to log into your systems? I mean, it's not rocket science. You don't actually need to go and spend a long time talking to anyone to realize that that's quite a bad thing to release. And, you're going to withhold it under
Mm.
an exemption. Like it's not complicated. You can kind of figure out what the answer is and just write it up. When it comes to commercial, what often happens is that you might be talking to a procurement colleague, you might be talking to someone in the business unit that did the procurement, and you're looking at this and you've never heard of this product or this service. You have no idea what it is. You don't know what the relationship is. You don't know what the sensitivities are. At this point, you can't kind of use common sense to figure out what the answer is. What you really need to do is you need to really engage with your colleagues. And if it is a commercial sensitivity of a third party, like a company, you actually need to engage with them as well. So there is a piece of education to be done with your colleagues. While a few minutes ago I was bemoaning the idea that I've worked in public authorities where people would simply say, "Oh, it's commercial. Okay, thanks, bye." That kind of wasn't their failure. It was probably the FOI team's failure, and I did quite a lot of work to turn that round. So there are some places like so IT are constantly being asked about spend. If you have a procurement team, they're being asked. There are places where you go, "Oh my God, I know they're constantly being asked about this kind of stuff." So your job is to educate them, and so it is to say to them, "Yes, I like." I think the first thing is, which is very, very, very important, is to point out that you're on their side, that your job is not to kind of override them and then just go ahead and release stuff. It's also to say, look, when I come back and ask you questions about this, and I'm kind of interrogating you, it's not because I'm not on your side or I don't believe you. It's actually so that I can put together the best possible answer and we can then therefore withhold this information now and if an internal review comes in, and if we go to the ICO. So that's really, really important. You can't be seen as the person where, someone puts a request in for a piece of information and they're terrified that you're just going to go ahead and release it. So it has to be the information asset owner. It has to be the business unit that makes the decision. And why? Well, partly because it's not your data and you don't understand it. The onus really should be on them, but it is their job to help you with enough information to be able to kind of break down to argue your case. So what you want to do during this education session is kind of talk about like your role and the attitude that you have, which is I'm here to help you withhold this, even if it's not true, and I'm here to help you put together the best argument. I'm not arguing with you and disbelieving you. I just need this because that's the only way we can get the exemption activated. The next bit, I think, is to kind of split it down into kind of real bullet points to say whose interests are being harmed. What are those interests? How likely do you think this will happen? And then the most difficult bit, the one in the middle, the causal chain. Can you give me an account of this? Just phone me up and tell me, and I'll write it down and then zip it back to you. If you have an internal messenger allows a voice clip, just get them to send you something so that you can write it down and send it back to them. Say, these are the three things that I need. And once I have those bits, then I can say, yes, the exemption is engaged. And this is what will help guard your data. So yeah, it is about forming that good relationship with the business unit. It's about educating them and really critically making sure that they understand that actually, even though you're asking them for more information, you're on their side. That they can't, the moment they just say, oh, it's commercial and walk away, you can't help them. And that's what you want to do. Now, even if the conclusion at the end of all of this is their arguments were terrible, you'll then have to go back and say, right, so we've got all of this, but according to the law, not me, it's not my fault, but according to the law, this won't stand up. All right, so is there anything else we can provide? Now, again, that's just with the business units. The other thing, the ICO, in its code of practice, on its website, it's constantly talking about conferring with third parties. And like going back, Naomi, to your original question, time limits.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on your relationship with that business unit. If I've worked in organizations where we literally had service level agreements, and service level agreement was I send this to you, you get back to me in 3 days. Now, 3 days to some places is ridiculous. It's not going to happen. Maybe you want to go, 7 or 8 days. I've seen 10 or 12 days. It doesn't matter. So long as there is a service level agreement that works for you, that there is time to escalate if they don't get back to you, that there is time to do redactions, etc., etc. But remember, with Section 43, because you've got to do these third-party consultations with any vendor or any company that might be harmed, you need to leave time in for that. And one of the really for them, usually I would just give them 3 to 5 working days to get back to you. And I do that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would just do something very, very, very short.
Stella's just put a comment, I think more a
Mm.
comment, but to say here that they often get sent just a paragraph of text from the service area, and that, I think it's a really important that we get that examples of harm, if you like, from third parties, so that if we are challenged at a later stage, that you've got that sort of
Yeah.
external evidence to say not only what is the harm, but why you're harmed, and also what the likelihood is. Um, I can see here, we're also talking about, I think Andy's put a comment up here about WhatsApp messages being used for business discussions that are in scope. I don't know if you want to take that, Bilal.
Yeah, any record. Any record is. It doesn't really matter what the medium is. Yeah, absolutely, it will be. And yeah, and but putting those three kind of questions out, that's literally I've developed a really, really short questionnaire. So when I send something off and I think, oh, this might be a 43, or if I subsequently discover, there's a really, really short form. It's not a long song and dance. It's just like, here are the three questions that I need. And if you just look at this and you think, I don't want to fill out this hateful form with these three questions, and just give me a call and I'll talk you through them. We'll chat about it, and we'll figure this out. I'll write it down, and then we'll share it. And you go, yep, that's kind of right. Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
now we've got a question that's sort of segueing a little bit, I think, here, because the questions talked about serial requesters, and it talks about the line between multiple or persistent requesters and vexatious. I don't think we're covering vexatious today, but I don't know if there's anything that you want to add about serial requesters, Bilal.
I, I mean, sometimes what is the line? Sometimes it's whether I had a good cup of coffee in the morning. I mean, so I mean, serial requesters. There is something within 14 around something being too onerous and causing disruption to the public authority. I would recommend that you go back to the Section 14 guidance. It's Section 14 is a funny one. It's all about how well can you defend it. It's kind of a bit principle based. There are no clear exact lines. It's like this is exactly what you need to do to be serial, and this is what tips into vexations. It's all about kind of evidence. But I think, as Naomi says, that's kind of not the topic for now. Section 12 might touch on this very, very slightly. So I think to the extent that we might address it, we will do so later on.
Okay. So, any questions you want to ask me, Bilal?
About Section 43, yeah. I mean, have you also? I mean, I kind of anecdotally, I just wanted to ask what your experience of 43 was. Do you get the impression that it was a lot easier and less rigorous, years and years and years ago, and that it's just become a bit more difficult now? Do you
I
have
think
any
that
impressions on
are
this
you
at all?
said what do you mean years and years and years ago? I don't know what you're suggesting there, Bilal, but
I'm
I'll
suggesting
take
you're
that with
very
a pinch of
experienced.
salt.
I'm suggesting you're extremely experienced, as am I.
What I would say is this: I always said we'd all be rich if we had £1 for every time we got a one-line email saying this is commercially sensitive.
Yeah,
And I think that we do spend a lot of time, and I spend a lot of time talking to lots of FOI officers all over the country who have the same problem in that they are trying to get that evidence of harm from the third parties. And sometimes it's a lot easier if they are the ones who can communicate with the third party to explain exactly what they need, if that's okay with the client department. And if it's not, I think your idea of using that pro forma with those questions and making it clear ultimately that it's the public authority who's going to make the final
yeah,
decision on
yeah,
whether it is commercially sensitive. Because with the best will in the world, companies will often tell you, oh, yes, it'll cause us to go bankrupt, even if there's no real evidence, because perhaps the retendering is in 10, 15 years' time, and that sensitive cost schedule might not be so sensitive at that point if you can't look to other contracts that are current at the moment. So I think that's definitely the big takeaway for me, Bilal. It's just getting that really good, cogent evidence of what exactly the harm is and the likelihood too, because people forget that you've got that choice between would or would be likely. So, much better than if we're in the EIRs, we get the choice. So let's use it.
yeah. No, no, exactly. It is all about evidence, and in some ways, like pretty much every Section 43 decision notice is the same. They kind of uses the same formula. They're always asking, "Did you answer this? Did you answer this? Did you answer this?" Like, use that to inform your questions, and then like this pro forma is really, really helpful. And I always find bullet pointing it and saying, "Here are three separate questions for you," but always also giving people the option. Because when it comes to the calls of chain, people get confused and just say, "Look, jump onto a call. I'll talk to you about it," because it's quicker to wheedle it out of them. Should we move on to Section 12? I've got
Sounds
some
like a
questions
plan.
for you. Great.
Yeah.
So one thing that I kind of find slightly confusing sometimes is that when it comes to Section 12, whenever I receive a Section 12 reply, some people talk about it as if it were an exemption. So is Section 12 an exemption, and is that the right language to use?
Well, it's certainly true that some people call it exemptions. I've even seen it called an exemption in some of the tribunal cases, for example. However, I prefer to think of it as a way to disapply the statutory right under Section 1. So, in other words, all the exemptions mainly are housed in this next part of the Act. But in the first part, we just decide, is it a valid request? Should we do that request? And if it's over the cost limit, then arguably we shouldn't. So we can apply Section 12. Or if the request is vexatious, we can consider Section 14. So you've got those choices before you ever get to those exemptions in Part 2, effectively.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then I guess the other perennial problem, kind of leading on from what you were saying, is you get that multi-part request. Or sometimes, kind of reflecting a bit of what Megan has asked, you kind of sorry, but what's been previously asked, you get several different FOI requests from the same person, and you suddenly discover that one question out of all of them exceeds the, answering would exceed the cost limits. Do you have to answer the other questions within the FOI request? What are the
And
rules?
the really clear answer to this is no. And I meet lots of public authorities who are answering maybe three, four, five parts of a six part and then just refusing on the sixth part. And both the ICO guidance and importantly, if you read 6.6 of the Code of Practice, which is section 45 Code of Practice, it's there in black and white. It says you don't have to answer any of the other parts of the question. So the best way to deal with it, and I often say what you can do is you can even link into that code of practice to explain to the requester why you're not answering those other parts. But you've got to use your section 16 advice and assistance and try and narrow that request. And most importantly, don't narrow it, but then say you can't deal with that either under section 12, or the ICO is likely to look at that quite carefully. So it's really about trying to refocus and reformulate. But what you might do is say, look, we could offer you three out of those four parts of the request, um, but it's the fifth part that would take us over that cost limit, generally speaking, 450, unless you're central government, etc. And then we're looking at £600 as a limit.
And so you're very clear. So if someone sends in one email with six questions in it, and one of question three exceeds cost limits, you can refuse all of it. You're going to do section 16 and say, look, we can give you these bits, but we can't give you that bit, and that's how you might narrow that down. What if they send in six separate emails?
Uh,
Yeah, right. What happens then?
Well, that's an interesting one, but you can't sort of get around it because potentially you could aggregate those costs together if they're within a 60 working day limit. But the issue you've then got to look at is it sort of same or similar information? So it's really having a look quite carefully at that, and then it may be that if four of those questions aren't similar but they are answerable, you can do that. If the one part, it may be so expansive that it still takes you over the cost limit, then you just simply refuse that one. However, you still got to try and narrow using your section 16 advice and assistance, or again, the tribunal cases show that they have to be used together, as does the code of practice.
Yeah, so I mean that's the thing. So I mean I think you've kind of already answered this. Is like the idea of emphasizing that 16 is not optional. I mean, I always found 16 really insulting in a way. It's the only piece of legislation where I've ever found where the public authority is being told to be nice, as if public authorities are not all lovely, lovely people. But yeah, so 16, what you're saying is not optional. The moment you use 12, I mean, almost your template must have something in it saying, what section 16 advice can I give?
It's also points for prizes because I know from reality working in a large public authority that often we do pick up the phone or we give advice and assistance via emails or other methods, but we don't always get our points for prizes because in our letter we might refuse, for example, under section 12, but we might not mention the fact that we're using that power of assistance. And so, months, years later, if it does get challenged, then there's no evidence that you've given that advice and assistance. So if you are being wonderful and helpful, just make sure that you evidence that in your letter. Because remember, if they do refine and reformulate that to a narrow request, you can then treat it as a new request and your clock goes back to the beginning. What's
Just,
not to like about that, really?
I'm just going to come in
Yeah.
here with a question that Irene's just put there about
Yes.
if the requester says you can respond, ignore any question that would go over the cost limit, can that still be honoured or refused?
Sorry, can you just say that again, Andy?
Sorry, I kind of was trying to summarize it quickly. If the requester says that you can respond, ignore any question that would make it go over the cost limit, and answer the others that are within the limit, can we honour that stipulation or refuse all of it under section 12 and then advise on section 16?
Well, my argument is they have reformulated then because they have suggested that they're happy, let's say, to have 1, 2, and 3 and not 4. So your time, it does get treated as a new request. It goes back to day one and you deal with it as such. And then at least they shouldn't be able to challenge you on the fact they never had part 4 because they themselves have reformulated that question. So I think that tactically, that's much better than trying to deal with 3, refuse the 1 and the 4th, and then there's just simply a challenge. Better to reformulate first, and you can always point them to 6.6 of the Code of Practice if they are, don't effectively believe that you don't have to sort of search up to the cost limit.
Yeah, because that's a critical thing. There's a case, I can't remember, it fits something, where it was a tribunal case, and they said you don't have to search up to the cost limit. So in the case that Irene has outlined, I would say no, I would refuse to handle it like that. I would say no, but which ones do you want? And then I will go and figure out which ones breach the cost limit. Like I'm not prepared to do all of that work and then make all of those
Oh,
decisions for you.
so I thought they had reformulated. I thought that was the point, that they'd
So,
come
so in
back
the
to you.
no, so if in the original request they
Oh, I
say, here
see.
are my 10 questions, if any of them cause you to go over the cost limits, please ignore those and answer the ones that you can.
No,
What do you do then? And I
no, I
would say,
agree.
yeah, go on.
I absolutely agree. Sorry, I thought you meant that they had then come back and reformulated and said, okay, we won't have number 4. But yeah, so I think we're all singing from the same hymn sheet then, Bilal. In other words, you go back to them, make them reformulate, and then if they reformulate and drop the part that's going to take you over, or they much, much narrow that request, that's when you deal with it.
I mean, you don't want to be doing too much unnecessary work. So if you look at something and say, "Can I have all the emails you've ever had about so and so?" and you look at it and go, "Mate, I don't really know what this is, but that's likely to breach." You can go back and say, "Look, under section 16, I can say I reckon question 4 might go over, but like we haven't done any searches. I don't know the answer. I reckon 3 might be under. Like this is a guide. So if you're already today concerned that this will breach the cost limits, I'm going to give you some intelligent guesses, but I will not stick. You can't hold me to them. If you want, why don't you just submit this, and then we'll go work it out. Tell you exactly what breaches the cost limit, and we'll do some work under 16 and advise you on how to narrow it down properly, so you can get something in, and then you can reformulate. But like we're not obliged to search up to the cost limit and ignore everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that was sort of said in one of the tribunal cases is it's got to be a sensible, realistic, and supported by cogent evidence. So it's not going to be an accurate scientific cost estimate, but it's got to be based on something. So whether you're sampling it by dip testing, having a look to see, is there how many files, how many minutes will it take you, so that you're basing it on something real and tangible. Do you agree, Bilal? Is that how you
Yeah,
do a cost estimate?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't, yeah, it can't be that scientific. You've got, it's an estimate. So, there's got to be some give and take. You can't sit down and read all 20,000 emails and go, this is exactly how long it took me. You dip sample, exactly as Naomi, you're saying, you might, you've got to be sensible. So, you might sort them in order of size and read two of the largest, two in the middle, two at the bottom, or one each, something sensible, and go, well, actually, on average, it's taking me this long to read, and this is how many emails there are, and that's roughly what it is. Like when you go to it, you may discover that there are these fiendish attachments, and actually, it all takes much longer than you even thought it was. So it has to be an estimate. But I'm really interested in something. So the ICO and the tribunal are really, really clear in that you do not have to provide your methodology for getting to the estimate in the answer to the requester. Uh, do you ever provide your estimate and how you reached it in your response?
I think there's a difference between what is absolutely mandatory in the
Yeah,
legislation and what is absolutely good practice
yeah,
and is really, I would say, necessary if you do get challenged, because you need to be able to demonstrate, and in fact, both the ICO will look quite carefully at your cost estimate to make sure that it is realistic and that you're not just effectively, guessing wildly. So you've got to base that on something. And I think that whilst it might not be mandatory, it's a bit like these days internal reviews for FOI. They might not be mandatory in the legislation, but they're considered good practice. And the ICO would have an expectation that you at least give a flavour of that cost estimate in your refusal, enough to make the requester understand, which I think is good practice in any event.
yeah. I would absolutely second that. I mean, I once wrote a 4-page explanation of why something would breach the cost limits. And it was really important because the public authority I was working for, we were asked for a piece of information where on the face of it, you just think we should be able to just get that information because it was that important and that basic, and it would, it would, it was very, very difficult. What you didn't want to do is look like you were a job's worth, just saying, computer says no, you can't have it, it'll cost too much, because of course that annoys people when, if I
Mm.
say this is going to cost too much, they're immediately there's this kind of very kind of well, no, I can't think of a polite way of saying it. There's a kind of a reaction that some people will have to say, but you work for me. How double dare you tell me that this is going to cost too much? You've got nothing else to do all day, and then they'll just get annoyed. But if I say to them, I'm really, really sorry, this is breached cost limits, and this is how I estimated it, at least they'll look at it and go, oh God, right. So you did think about it, and you didn't just
Yeah.
make up a number. So yeah, absolutely, I would second what you're saying, Naomi. The fact that you don't have to do it doesn't really mean that much. It is good practice because if you explain to people why it would cost too much, and then I think very interesting, Richard is asking, would the cost estimate not fall under Section 16? Well, yeah. So if you're going to tell people how to narrow stuff down, by providing them with an estimate and how you reached it, that might well help them to understand how to narrow it down. So that
Mm.
might help them say, well, this contract's been running for 10 years. Can I actually just have the emails from the last 3 months, for example?
But
Because that might,
also, oh, sorry, Bilal, to
please.
interrupt,
No,
but I
please,
was
please.
thinking, it just occurred to me also, it's really important to remember that redaction does not count in our cost estimate. So, it's only for things like retrieval and thinking time doesn't count. So that's probably when we come back to Noah's point, because at some point we might have to consider Section 14, whether it's an undue burden, if we like, and looking at those sort of issues in the tribunal case of Dransfield, um, if it's got a high level of redaction, because you could have 72 hours of redaction, but that doesn't count for anything in your cost estimate.
Yes, it won't count to 12. Could count to 14, but it
Yeah,
won't count to 12. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And it's really, really worth, although we're not covering 14, 14 has this whole section on requests that are onerous. Um, and I once in another life shut down around 1,200 FOI requests in 2 weeks on the ground that they would be too onerous under 14. This is when public PCTs, primary care trusts were being shut down. They had no staff left, and it was just not possible to answer any of these requests, and we had to shut them all down. A really interesting question. Does the 20-day clock start while you're trying to work out the time frame of the questions to go back to the requester to refine the request? Well, the 20-day clock, so if you go back, if you're using section 12, and that's one of the reasons why it's really important, is because it's not an exemption. And this is why it becomes important. It is a grounds on which to refuse the obligations in section 1. So it is a ground for refusing to deal with the request.
yeah.
And so if you invoke section 12 and you reply saying this breaches a cost limit, when they come back and refine something, the clock restarts. Because actually the first case, I mean, yes, it was an FOI case, but because of the way in which you refuse it, it actually invalidates it as a legitimate request. And so it is a good idea, whereas no exemption does that. But either way, you close the case down by citing section 12 and section 16, and then when they refine, they come back to you, the clock restarts, because now you have hopefully a valid FOI request.
I'm just having a look. I think that's covered. I think that's covered all the questions on the side. Below, I don't know if you can see any that we haven't
I've,
covered.
I've just
No, no,
put
no.
another one in there just now, Naomi, if you want to have a look at that one.
Oh, so I think clients are reporting that they're being overwhelmed, by chat GPT generated requests. Is this something that you're hearing too? And I can say yes, I'm getting quite a lot of feedback um, in all areas actually of information compliance about requesters that are using AI more and more. And I think that there is perhaps something to be distinguished between whether a person is using AI as an aid to help them make a request, which I think is valid, or whether at some point AI itself is making its own request. Um, and if it's some sort of automated request, which might not be valid. What do you think about that, Bilal?
Well, unless it becomes conscious, it will be making it on behalf of someone. So long as someone is initiating that, then I'm not sure it would be invalid. I mean, it's a bit like using any kind of other tool. I mean, it's more efficient for me to use email rather than write a letter and post it. Uh, I can't see that. I mean, in some ways, to be honest, I've had so many requesters and so many public authorities where you'd look at it and go, God, mate, that was written by AI, and then I tell you that no, that actually request came in 15 years ago, because they're just able to produce volumes of stuff. With the most ridiculous references and like carry on going and sending in repeated requests. So a lot of people just never needed this to produce tons and tons of nonsense. Um, We've had a go. We're just reading the chat. We often receive additional ones from the same individual even before the 20-day working period is closed. This doesn't breach. Yeah. So this question from Thanuja, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Um, uh, it feels excessive. People are allowed to put in more than one request at a time. And I guess, like Naomi, it might be very, very useful to kind of work out what are the exact rules for aggregating requests. So you mentioned
Yes.
a time frame.
So coming back to aggregation of costs, yes, you can aggregate the costs. That means you can take several requests, providing they come in a 60-day working period, and they're on a same or similar information. So that's the key, really. And it could be the same person or it could be people working together. The problem sometimes is working out if people are working together. Of course, that's always a bit more difficult. Um, but even one thing I would add is that sometimes what happens, and you see this in tribunal cases as well, is that one person puts in a request and then the public authority thinks, oh, they're putting in another request, but actually they're just trying to clarify their first request. And I think not only should we use our advice and assistance, but we should also use our power of clarification, which is under section 1, subsection 3, because when we do that, we can sort of make sure that we both know what the question actually is, because sometimes there's a lot of room for interpretation, as you know, Bilal. And effectively, it might be that they're just trying to clarify their request or they're trying to chase it up. So it's really worth using that power because, again, the clarification also stops the clock and sends it back to the beginning. So, what's not to love about clarification if you feel there is any ambiguity? So, to try and answer that question as best I can, yes, you can apply Section 12 to costs. You can aggregate all of those together if they are within that 60-day working period, providing they're on the same or similar type information.
And as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, like the ICO is really generous on what same or similar is. So if I ask for the chief executive's expenses and then ask for how much did your toilet paper cost, would like are those two similar enough because they're asking about spend? Is that similar?
Hmm.
Like what does it mean? What are the rules around similarity? Do you know them off the top of your head? So I can't quite like the ICO is
I don't think,
generous.
for me, that is perhaps a little bit too generous, toilet paper spend and chief exec, but I guess we all interpret these things slightly differently.
Yeah, we do. So my recollection is the ISO is really, really quite helpful. So if it's minutes of a meeting for one thing and the minutes of a meeting for something unrelated, they're both minutes of a meeting, and the ICO is actually happy to say that they are broadly similar. Like they're excitingly helpful in this area. Like more so, I think maybe less than I'm suggesting, but slightly more than Naomi, who is probably a lot more helpful than I am. So yeah, I would like go back and have a look at that. The point at which, so to address specifically this question, but getting multiple requests at the same time from a person, it doesn't breach FOI regulations. How clarify the rules around refusing such requests. You've got to be able to make a case under Section 14, right? And like again, that's not really the topic that we're dealing with today, but go and read like the Section 14 advice. The ICO guidance is actually one of the more helpful pieces of guidance. I often find that ICO guidance doesn't quite use the examples I wish that they would, but this really does. So I would go back and have a look, and if you can then start looking at a pattern of requests and start deeming the requests to be vexatious because they are causing disproportionate burden or disruption, then yes, that's where. All right, but it's very, very difficult. Everything is on a case by case basis.
Okay, just looking, I think people are still wanting to talk about AI and we're running out of time rapidly, but I'm going to say certainly when you're getting these requests through and they're not making much sense and I've seen them as well where they are very long and there's a lot of text and you think this does feel like it's had some AI involvement, let's just put it like that. I think it's so important to go back and clarify. And if they do come back to you and it still doesn't make sense, then I think that you have to further try and clarify because at the end of the day, you can't answer something if you don't actually know what they want. And therefore, again, you have to consider, does it go down the Section 12 route or does it perhaps go down the Section 14 vexatious route? And perhaps that's a topic for another webinar, Bilal.
Yeah, no, 14 is always a perennial question. People don't use it enough. I mean, I think that yes, if a name and an email address is attached, then it becomes very difficult to say that came from AI. Like you can intelligently guess that, but you don't really have enough of a basis to kind of say this is from AI. I mean, at the end of the day, most AI, mean, AI is not making unprompted requests, I'm guessing, unless anyone knows better. I'm guessing that the origin are people sticking something in there. So
11:54.
yeah, so that's kind of what I'm guessing. Even if they're put in through an AI tool, yeah, absolutely. As Naomi says, go back and ask for clarification. I mean, I've even gone back. I've had these 20-page complaints about something, and in the middle, randomly it mentions FOI, and you look at it and go, but how many of these others is that an FOI? Is that bit an FOI? Just go back and ask for clarification. Yeah, absolutely. As Naomi says, clarification is your friend. Go back and ask and say, thanks very much. We've noticed that some of your questions you may want to ask under FOI. Can you please give me a numbered list of those questions you want to ask under FOI? And then inevitably they send you a list of 38 questions. And then we go back to our old friend cost limits and go, no.
I think Andy wants us to get our crystal ball out for our
Yes,
last question because
crystal
he's
balls out.
asking
Yeah,
us, what does FOI look like in 5 years? It also almost reminds me of the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
that's what I was basing it on, Naomi. Where do you
Well,
see
with
yourself
no
in?
job.
Uh, I'm assu I'm tempted to say that I hope to God I'll be retired in 5 years, and so it'll be a distant, blissful memory. It's really difficult to say because we're in this very, very odd we're in this very, very odd place where it appears that there's more information out there for us to have a look at, and I can ask ChatGPT stuff for stuff, and it will make more well, it'll make some searches that it would not occur to me to make. So it might retrieve more relevant information. But on the other hand, Naomi Alderman has said that we're in the age of the information crisis. So no one quite believes what they're being told anyway. And so what you might want to do is just go back to the public authority and ask them because you're kind of daring them to lie to your face. What will it look like? Could get much worse, could get better. Chaos, no idea, could go anyway.
I know there's certainly some AI tools being developed at the moment that are supposed to help find the information and make that quicker. And certainly it'd be interesting to see the way that the tribunal case law develops, because up to now, I would say the tribunals, despite the records management code of practice, have said you take the public authorities, you find them, and if their case management system's a bit cronky, then it might take them longer to find it, and that's okay as far as costs are concerned. So as these new tools come in, if a public authority decides to use them, then I think that will have a real effect on the cost estimate, and it may make things much quicker to find. Of course, if they do find the perfect redaction method, then who knows? Maybe there'll be no Section 14 undue burden. I just don't know. It's can it do it as well as an FOI officer or an information officer? I suspect no, but I stand to be corrected.
Yeah. Okay. And I think on that kind of future focus point, we'll call a halt to today's webinar. Thanks again to Naomi and Bilal for their expert knowledge. You'll come back again, will you guys, to do another one at some point? Not in
Of
five
course.
years' time, but in 2026.
Sure.
Let's hope so.
Okay, and we'll be taking suggestions from delegates today about which courses, oh sorry, which webinar subjects they might be interested in. Coming up in the future, in the new year, we've got DSPT webinar and a SAR processing one, so kind of related subject areas. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining today. I found it really interesting. Just to remind you again, we do run FOI courses. Actually, on the basis of the conversation today, I think I might have to sign up for the one-day course and bring my skills and knowledge up to scratch, in addition to consultancy services. And finally, hope to see you all at our free conference in February. No excuses.
Thanks
Thanks
very
very
much,
much,
everyone.
everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.